Our story about geodesign starts 12 years ago in the year 2000 with some, let's see, there we go, in the year 2000. And our story had some very unusual and interesting collaborators that led to the outcome that I'm going to tell you about. The story is really good, but in the interest of time, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about where we wound up, and maybe someday in the future I can tell you all the other stories. But anybody guess what the common interest is between Jeb Bush, pizza, panthers, and cowboys? Any idea? Other than Jeb Bush's brother is a cowboy, and Jeb was the governor of the state of Florida in the year 2000 when our process began. Panthers are one of the most critically endangered species in the country. At the time that we started our process, there were estimated to be less than 100 panthers. And of course, panthers and cowboys don't always get along together. And the pizza I'm going to tell you about a little bit later. But cowboys do like pizza. So rural land stewardship is, in its essence, it's a way of incentivizing private interest to accomplish the public good. And in our case, it's incentivizing the removal of development rights from private land and thereby conserving in perpetuity critical resources and allowing them to be managed privately, at the same time trying to protect important agricultural lands for food production, and finally to promote sustainable growth in the appropriate locations and try to get all these things to sort of integrate with each other and match. And I'm going to emphasize the word incentive-based because what you'll see in a minute is that one of the unique things about this program is that it relies on no regulations and it relies on no public funding in order to accomplish these objectives. So the rural land stewardship area I'm going to talk about, and there's actually another one in Florida and some in the works, but the one we're going to talk about is the first one. It's 300 square miles. It sits in the northeastern corner of Collier County, and if you know Florida, Naples and Fort Myers has been one of the fastest growing MSAs for years and years. The neighbor to the east of the RLS is what's commonly called the Western Everglades or the Big Cypress Swamp. And this area is not only home to a significant agricultural production center in Florida for winter vegetables and citrus, as well as cattle, hence the cowboys. We do have cowboys in Collier County. But it is also the primary range of the endangered Florida panther and a whole host of other listed species, critical wetlands, as you can imagine, on the edge of the Everglades. So it's an important area that had no plan and no idea of how it was going to be developed or conserved over time. And so there was a whole lot of bad things happening in 2000. There was litigation. The NGOs were suing the county. The county was going to downzone the property, and it was just a big mess. And what happened is that through some conversations, the governor said, look, you guys take a time out. We're going to give you 3 years. See if you can come up with a better plan for dealing with the future of this area than going to court and fighting over property rights and regulations. And so he issued a final order that said, protect prime ag lands, protect critical wetland and upland habitat, and then utilize some creative techniques for accommodating future growth. It didn't tell us how to do it, didn't give any funding to do it, it just said this is what needs to be done. And so we got involved with property owners and with NGOs and the local government. We started a 3-year journey to see if we could figure out a solution to this problem, with the understanding that if we didn't, the lawyers were waiting, in the back row to resume the litigation and do it the old-fashioned way. So what was the threat for this area? The University of Florida did an analysis of the entire state of Florida, which would be a great topic for another geodesign, but they said if current trends continue out into the future, what does the state of Florida look like in 2060? And in our case, this rural land stewardship area, which is 200,000 acres, this is what was forecast in 2060, and all that red is development. So the NGOs called this the blood map because what was happening is that rural sprawl was bleeding all over the countryside. It was fragmenting habitat. And the net result was going to be that in an area that had essentially no development in 2000, by the year 2060, it was going to be fragmented into lots and lots of ranchettes, and you know. So this was an outcome that obviously frightened a lot of people, appropriately so. And in Florida, we have something called the Burt-Harris Act, which says that if you're a property owner and you have current development rights, those are protected. The government cannot take those away from you through regulation or any way other than acquisition of your property. So this is not an unrealistic scenario at the point at which development overtakes agriculture as an economic driver. So the key concepts of stewardship, and I'm going to, even though we have a program that I'm going to talk about stewardship, this is now actually a statewide program in the state of Florida, but the concepts are the same. It applies outside of urban boundaries. It's based on scientific data and market-driven economic incentives. For the participation of a private property owner, they have the choice of either participating or not, hence it has to be incentive-based. It requires a long-term vision. In our case, the vision now is a 2050, so it's not 250 years, but it's certainly out there far enough where you can accomplish some big things. It has to be created through a collaborative public-private process because everybody's got a stake in the game and everybody has, in many cases, competing interests. If you think about ag guys versus cattle ranchers versus environmental, agencies, that all doesn't always nicely fit together, so there has to be a collaborative process. The concept is that the private ownership and management of important natural resources is a viable alternative to public acquisition. And you have to believe that that's the case, and we have some mechanisms in which we ensure that occurs. And then the final concept is that the economics of quality growth can leverage the far-reaching public benefits. In other words, there's a value proposition to quality growth, and if you can tap into just a little sliver of that, you can accomplish some things that you cannot accomplish any other way. So how the program works is using GIS, we created a new currency called a stewardship credit. And a stewardship credit is created out of the natural resource and agricultural values of property. And it's calculated using a GIS database that we put together. I wish we had the new stuff, but we were working with the old stuff back in 2000, but it did the job just perfectly. But we create a regionally specific natural resource index, which I'll share in a minute. That index creates a credit value, and that credit then can be used by a property owner to eliminate their rights and to sell that credit to somebody who has a plan to develop a sustainable community. So you have sending areas and receiving areas, which is kind of a common planning idea of transfer of development rights, but there's some very big differences in this program from the traditional TDR. So to develop a receiving area in a stewardship area, you must acquire credits. The credits actually entitle footprint as opposed to density. So it's, again, a little different concept here, which is what we're trying to do is shrink the footprint of development on the landscape, thereby enabling the conservation of agriculture and critical habitat. And you have to then calibrate the credit system, and by calibrating it, you arrive at a balance between these various outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And again, we're using GIS to calibrate it using different scenarios of index values and credits until you get to the mix that has the best result. So my GIS team said, you got to put a slide in about the software and the methodology. I'm not a GIS expert, so I'm sure this will mean a lot to many of you in the room, but what I will tell you is that GIS is not only the platform for how we put it together, but it was the therapist, as Bryn was talking about, or Jack, you were talking about this idea that this can actually become the way of bringing people together. And what happened at the start of our process is we had people that did not trust each other, that would not talk to each other, that would not agree on anything. You could take them out to a piece of property and they would have 3 different opinions of whether that was panther habitat or a farm field. And by spending a year and a half just building the database, we got these disparate people to start talking to each other. And we finally got them to agree on a map that they could say, yeah, that represents what's on the ground. And we did that before we started doing any of the future planning, because we had to get them to the point where they at least trusted each other at some level. Without a GIS platform, we never could have accomplished that. So we started building this natural resource index, and what we did is we took a lot of data, things like in the panthers, a lot of them have been collared with GPS collars, so we had a lot of telemetry that we could use. We had the typical flux data, we had subsurface hydrology, soils data, and what we did is we started putting all of this information together and giving it relative scores, because what we had to do is take a whole lot of stuff and turn it into a tool. And so we took different attributes, we scored it, we would then run maps to show what that looked like as a digital representation of an environmental system. And we then calibrated it with scientists by saying, does that look right? Does this match with what you think makes sense using traditional methods? And finally we got to an index that everybody said, yeah, that represents the values that we think are close enough for a planning tool. And the nice thing about this is that it's not static in time because natural environments change. So in our system, even though we have a map like this that scores every acre within 200,000 acres, those scores will change depending on the final attributes at the time that a property owner decides to participate. So if a property owner can do something to improve his score over time, that's a good thing. So then we took another concept, which is that if you're a private property owner and you have a panther, or you have a red cockaded woodpecker, guess what? That devalues your property based on the regulatory paradigm. So you don't want to have that stuff. You want to get rid of it, you want to clear the vegetation. So what we did is we said, okay, we're going to turn the credit system in reverse, and the higher score you get, the more credit you're going to get under our system. So all of a sudden, property owners that saw listed species as a liability said, wait a minute, if I manage my land to the good of listed species, and if the wetlands stay in a pristine condition, now I can get rewarded for that, and the reward is a monetary reward through more credits that they receive in that process. The interesting thing that came out of this is not only did this tell us what needed to be protected and incentivize what needed to be protected, but it also told us where there was land that frankly didn't rise to the level of needing the same kind of protection. So that's where we started saying we can identify places where development in the future can go, because if it doesn't have a score of X, it doesn't rise to a level of significance. And so that was sort of a byproduct of the Natural Resource Index. And again, we don't have time to look at this, but we put the whole credit system on a worksheet, and basically it uses the Natural Resource Index as one parameter of a credit generation. And then the other parameter is what is a property owner willing to give up? Because if you think about it, property owners have more than one use of their land. They may be farming it today, but they may have development rights to build homes in the future. They might have mining rights. They might have all kinds of different things they could do. So what we gave property owners at their request is selectivity, so that they could say, you know what, I'm willing to eliminate the right to develop houses and mines and all that, but I want to keep the right to farm the property, and I get a certain value for that. If I'm willing to take it all the way down to conservation, I get a different value. If I'm willing to restore the land beyond just keeping it as it is, I get a different value. And when you multiply those two indexes, that number and that index together, that tells you how many credits you get. So again, it gives property owners choices, it gives a variable scale, and it gives some flexibility to the implementation of the program. So these credits then become essentially the currency. So here's where the pizza comes in. So we put this program together. It took about 3 or 4 years. We put it in place. It was very innovative. Nobody had ever seen anything quite like it before. Nobody thought it was going to work. And Tom Monahan, who founded Dominos Pizza, sold Dominos Pizza. And with all the money that he made, he said, I'm going to devote this to higher education for the rest of my life, specifically higher Catholic education. He's a devout Catholic. And he says, I'm going to build a new university somewhere in Florida. And then one of the property owners in eastern Collier County said, hey, we've got this program. I'd like to build a new town. You've got a university town might make sense. Let's use the program to build a new town. And so they got together and collaborated, and the result of that was we put together a master plan, and we created the first receiving area, which is the new town of Ave Maria. That's a picture back in '06 when it more or less opened. It's since grown somewhat from that, but ultimately it's a town of 5,000 acres. It will accommodate a population of 25,000 people, and it's on a footprint that's like 1/10 of what it would have been had we not had the ability to use the stewardship program as a result. And by building this new town, we retired 17,000 stewardship credits, which made our environmental friends happy because it protected a couple of very significant panther corridors that they had been lusting after to get into public or into protection, because without it being in protection, they couldn't get funding for the overpasses, which are where the panthers have to cross under roads. So anyway, it all came together, and all of a sudden we have developers, environmentalists, on the same side of the table, all saying, yeah, let's approve this project because there's good things that are going to happen that benefit not just the developer, but the environment. So that new town is very neat. It opened right as the recession went like this, so it certainly didn't grow as fast as anybody thought it would, but it's actually now coming back pretty quickly. And it's quite a fascinating place, and we actually had to create a whole set of design guidelines to make sure that even the development is going to be implemented in a sustainable way. So, I mean, everything from dual water systems, and we have sort of all the tricks, if you will, inside the town to make it fit within that kind of a larger context of an important area. So where are we today in the program? And again, we had 196,000 acres of land, all in private ownership. Only 16,000 acres when we started was protected. Today we have 55,750 acres that have been put into stewardship sending. And actually the two most critical areas, which are these two long things you see on the west, is the Camp Keys Strand, which connects the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, which is a world-class cypress preserve that's managed by the Audubon Society. It connects that all the way down to the Panther Preserve. So we now have that whole corridor in place. And on the east side is the Caloochee State Forest at the top, and it connects all the way down. So now we have a corridor because panthers are wide-ranging species. They will typically hunt, 50,000 acres. So they need to be able to move across the landscape unencumbered. So that happened in 6 years from the time that we put the program in place. Our adopted target for 2025 was 90,000 acres, so we're more than halfway to our 2025 goal, and we have a 2050 goal of 134,000 acres. And that 134,000 acres is going to include not just habitat and natural resource areas, but it's going to include farms, because we now have a credit that's specific to keeping active agriculture in place as well. So we think that we certainly exceeded everybody's expectations in terms of the rate at which the program is embraced. And the reason we did that, as it was mentioned this morning, if you reward certain behaviors, then you get those behaviors. Well, what we did is we said, you know what, there isn't a demand for credits today because there's not a real development pressure. So we created an early entry bonus, said if you, the property owner, are willing to come in and put your land into a perpetual stewardship easement today, we're going to give you extra credit for doing that. And if you commit to restoring certain parts of your land, we'll give you extra credit for that, but that early entry bonus had an expiration date. So we got a lot of folks that jumped in and says, we're willing to do this on the idea that someday we're going to be able to use these credits, and in the meantime, we're going to bank them. We have the one receiving area, which is Ave Maria. We have another that's sort of on the back burner right now. So you can see the ratio right now of conservation to development is a good ratio. Ultimately, it's going to be even better. So far, we've saved at least $200 million on public acquisition, and that's compared to our county's public land purchase program, where they actually go out and buy the land. Here, if they had bought the land that's been protected, it would have actually been probably more than $200 million. We've had $350 million investment in private infrastructure in a rural part of Florida that really needed some economic boost. And we've added $190 million to the tax base of Collier County, just with what's in place today, which is about 15% of what we expect in the future. So again, the concept here is that there's not enough public money to buy everything that should be protected. If you can find a way to protect land in a different way through incentives, that's a good thing. you can also use this concept, for example, if there are limited dollars but it needs to be in public ownership, a government could buy the credits, essentially retire the credits, not develop, but retire the credits, and the property owner still has some residual economic benefit from his land, so they can buy the credits less expensively than if they had to buy the land in fee. And finally, I mean, the big aha moment here was that all of a sudden environmental assets become an asset to a private property owner as opposed to a liability, provided that they believe in the long-term stewardship of the land. So our 2050 vision for this area looks something like this. I think the total conservation between, and I'm calling ag preservation conservation, it's really not, but what we have found is that even ag lands serve an important purpose for species. For example, panthers actually like to, at night, they will go into the farm fields as part of their hunt for prey. But anyway, 134,000 acres is our goal. A maximum of 45,000 acres of development. I don't think we're going to get there because right now I think the trend is that densities are coming up so that I think the footprint can reduce. And the original 16,000 acres of public lands is still there. So going back to comparing where we would have been potentially had we not had a program like this, on the left, the blood map, and on the right, the concept plan that has been adopted. It's certainly a good outcome. It's a big change from where we were. It's something that has been supported since it was adopted, and it's working as it was designed to work. So I'll leave you with our big idea in Florida is we then took this same idea and we analyzed the entire state of Florida, which, believe it or not, is still about 70% rural. Once you get 10 miles from the coast on either side, you're in farmland and you know, environmentally valuable land. So we said if you 1 out of 5 acres of if 20% of the growth, okay, over the next 25 years was accommodated within this kind of a program, what we would have is 2.9 million acres of land as stewardship. We would have protected 1.4 million acres of habitat without taxpayer funding, and that's more acres that are on the Florida Forever's wish list right now, which, by the way, they don't have the funds to buy. You would have 1 million plus acres of ag that has been kept for agriculture because ag is just as important as any other, in fact, more important for a lot of us that like to eat. We need to have ag land, and we would have 1.3 million people inside of these stewardship communities having done something by living in that community to actually help the larger landscape within which they live. And then the footprint of growth would have been reduced somewhere between 80 and 90% over the conventional kind of development that you typically get in rural areas.